Hello, and welcome to the Pagan Perspective podcast. I'm your host, Georgina Rose. I'm a perennialist and polytheist, and on this show, I give a pagan, occult, and esoteric view on the issues and topics that we deal with in our mundane lives, offer a spiritual explanation for them, explore the esoteric ramifications of them, explore the meaning of mysticism, and break down our ever changing world and how to use the gods and the esoteric to live a thriving life in post modernity. And in this episode of Pagan Perspectives, I'm going to be kind of piggybacking off what I talked about last episode. So, last episode, I talked a lot about artificial intelligence and the rise of AI within our society, the rapid changing technological progress that we are dealing with in our world, and what that means spiritually. And all of that kind of especially when I got into the possibility of AI cults or people wanting to kind of escape reality into the technological world, it all starts pointing a little bit towards transhumanism. Now, you do not need to have listened to that episode before this one. They're not, part one, part two. They're just related topics. But if you enjoy this conversation or if you enjoyed that conversation, you'll probably enjoy the other. Because transhumanism is a little bit different, but I think these things do connect. I think the zeitgeist of this time is one of rapid change, right? One of rapid reconfiguration of what it means to be alive. We are in the technological revolution. And one of the ideologies that is coming out of this technological revolution is I would call it a philosophy. I think that's probably the best descriptor, though I'll get into some of the other things people call it, of transhumanism. To be clear, transhumanism and the topic of like being transgender are not the same topic. I'm not going to get into that on this podcast. That's a completely different discussion. I'm talking about transhumanism. A lot of people really just confuse those ideas. So to be clear, not really the same thing. Transhumanism is a philosophy that has been around for a while, but is really gaining steam now, and is really finally being able to be practiced truly. And it is basically the idea of, we know trans means to transform, to change, to transfigure. Human is what we are. So basically what it is it is trying to essentially extend, alter, and enhance our lives by going into technology. So, what that means in practice and what it often refers to is, and it's kind of like amusing way to explain it, it's kind of like the ideology of becoming a cyborg, but on a more literal level. I mean, that kind of is what it is, but it's a little more complicated than that. It's basically using as much tech as possible to alter our bodies, alter our minds, alter our consciousness, to break beyond our human form. Transhumanism posits that the human form, and I will say they are correct in this assumption, I just don't think their conclusion is right. The human form is a weak and fragile form. We age, we die, and, we are, fundamentally in a natural world that poses a lot of threats to us, right? We get cancer, we live for a long time, or we live for a relatively short time. Transhumanists definitely want to extend human life, some to a really extreme degree, and we have limitations, right? So transhumanism wants to basically eliminate all those limitations, make us live a more comfortable life, and give us as many advantages as possible. Common transhumanist ideas are life extension or eliminating death, which I'll get to that later. And I'll get to the Don't Die movement, which is a product of transhumanism, and my thoughts on that from an esoteric perspective. It also can refer to implanting chips into our bodies to, say, unlock our apartments. Giving us new eyes that could see better, right? Basically, like completely assimilating us into tech. It does become very cyborgy very fast. And this, since it is such a philosophical claim about the problems with humans being limited, flawed creatures, it becomes kind of religious really fast. It becomes a rejection of our human form. For this reason, a common criticism of transhumanism is that transhumanism is a sort of neo-Gnosticism, that it kind of relates to Gnostic thought. And I have complicated feelings on that because I do see why people have reached this conclusion, but I actually don't think it's correct. So Gnosticism, I think we need to be clear, refers to a lot of different things. There is no like singular Gnosticism. A lot of people, when they think of Gnosticism, they think of this meme that goes around on the internet. It's like an old internet meme where basically, like, it's this comic called Le Sad Demiurge. I recommend pulling it up, and I'm gonna actually read it to you guys, just and visualize it in your head if you haven't seen it, or you could Google Le Sad Demiurge and follow along. So this, I think it's from a probably like a forum or an image board originally. I don't know. It's definitely an old comic, and basically it's a image of the demiurge. For those who don't know, Gnosticism in its very reductionist form basically posits it's an Abrahamic philosophy, and it posits that this realm, Earth, the material realm, was created by an entity known as the demiurge. The demiurge is a false god. The demiurge is not the true god. And then above this realm, there is an actual true god, the real god. And demiurge essentially has us in this like prison planet where everything is evil. The material is evil. This world is evil. And to truly, become enlightened and reach spiritual goals, you have to break beyond this material world and achieve gnosis. Gnosis means knowledge. And saying you want to achieve gnosis, to be clear, is not a solely Gnostic thing. Gnosis as a term just refers to like achieving a state of knowledge. Pretty much every spiritual path has the goal of gnosis. But what sets Gnosticism apart is it sees gnosis as a way to reconnect with this higher God, this true God. And the sort of cultural interpretation that the normies have of it is this comic that I'm about to read. So visualize the demiurge. So it's a serpent with a lion on its head. And the serpent says, I'm going to use my power to create a world where billions and billions of people will be able to live and experience the wonders of being alive. And then it cuts to the demiurge creating the world. And then it says 6,000 years later. And then there's a stick figure guy with a broken ankle. And he says, hey, I twisted my ankle today. Who can I blame this on? And then from stage right enters the Gnostic schizo, the Gnostic, who says, fear not, O imprisoned spark of the divine, for the blind, ignorant tyrant who has imprisoned you in this realm, the demiurge, is but a worthless shell who you can overcome if you put your mind to it. Look beyond the limitations of this prison that cosmic sadist built, and ye shall see the true light of the monad. And then it cuts back to the stick figure man who says, yeah, the demiurge, fuck that guy. And then it cuts to the demiurge, our lion serpent, crying. And it says, le sad demiurge, okay? This is a funny little comic. I think it's pretty good. And basically what this is someone critiquing Gnosticism, but basically explaining Gnosticism as, okay, well, this guy created this beautiful world, and Gnostics are like these assholes who just like hate this world, and they blame the demiurge for their problems. And I will say this is a very good mimetic interpretation of Gnosticism. It's pretty funny. I like this comic. I dressed up as the little Gnostic from it at one point for Halloween and posted it to Instagram. But I will say, this is not the whole of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is not just people like hating the material world. That's not really what it is. The reason why Gnosticism detests the material world is that they believe it is essentially like a false prison. I'm sure you guys have heard of like Plato's cave, where like there's these people in the cave and they see these like shadows and they think these shadows are, God or whatever. And then like, you walk out of the cave and you realize there's more to the world in the cave, and these shadows are just guys holding puppets. And it's like basically an exploration of like enlightenment. And then like you go back to the cave, you tell the other people, oh my God, this is fake. And they're not going to believe you, right? That's more what I would say Gnosticism is. And I want to also clarify, not all Gnostics think alike. Gnosticism is a broad spectrum of ideas that really has lasted for a very long time and actually influences modern occultism in some ways. There is a specific type of Gnosticism that really dissents from this called Valentinian Gnosticism, where basically what it thinks is, yes, we were created by the demiurge. The demiurge is not the higher god, but the demiurge is not wholly evil. The demiurge is not sadistic. The demiurge created this realm in basically its attempt to be good. But since the demiurge is not the highest form of divinity, right, it was imperfect because it's a reflection of an imperfect creator. Gnosticism is considered the original heresy of Christianity. It was, basically kind of claiming that God is evil, because what Christian Gnostics often kind of argue, and there's two ways to argue it, right? Either like the Christian divinity is evil, or you see this common perspective of basically the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? The Old Testament and the New Testament are very different. If you have read both, or even have a general understanding of both, there's a big tone shift, right? The way that Old Testament God behaves and New Testament Jesus behaves is quite different. So there are a lot of Christian Gnostics who basically believe the Old Testament God is the demiurge and Jesus Christ is who the real God sent to sort of show us the way. And in a sense, Christianity is very anti-material. Christianity, of course, a lot of the things that are sins in Christianity are kind of material desires. And if you become, a Christian who's actually following that properly, it is very asceticist, right? It's an asceticist religion. And of course, people who are very serious Christians, especially people who are like monks, are really rejecting the material world in a very profound way, right? And so you can get Gnosticism and like regular Christianity squared pretty well. Of course, that's still a heresy. That still would have gotten you burned like a couple hundred years ago. But yeah, Gnosticism is a wide range of things. And I think where this idea comes is, okay, transhumanists think our material beings are wrong, right? Like our bodies need to be corrected. Because fundamentally, if you believe in transhumanism, you are asserting the human body is flawed and wrong, right? And a lot of religions have a huge issue with transhumanism. I mean, this isn't just a Christian thing, this is a broad thing of if we are created by some sort of good being, right? Like if you believe in like any sort of Platonism or Platonic influenced religion, right? You believe in the idea of forms or like things objectively existing. And if goodness and truth and whatnot exist, then you can get a pretty good argument that our creator represents goodness. And so if you're saying humans are all flawed and us humans need to invent various contraptions to become good, right? You are kind of arguing that we are created by something imperfect. So any religion that posits that we have a good creator who created humans in a powerful way, you conflict with transhumanism. A lot of religions who are even not human centric, like of course Christianity thinks God is men are made in the image of God. But even religions that don't argue that and just argue like our creator is a good entity that has done this, or there's a lot of pagans, who are very Platonic, who are like, well, Zeus is goodness, Jupiter is goodness, right? Odin is goodness in a sense, right? And so if you believe that sort of interpretation of paganism, you're also going to have a problem with transhumanism because transhumanism is implying that our base form is wrong, that it needs to be corrected. And you get with transhumanism the idea that humans inventing technology is what's going to save humanity. And so that's where it starts diverging from Gnosticism. Because in Gnosticism, by finding gnosis, you are breaking past your material form. You're breaking towards, the Godhead. But if it's through just like inventing things, that's not really what Gnosticism is saying. And we need to remember that when we're talking about transhumanism, we are talking about, in really extreme cases, people arguing that we need to go into technology, right? Like we need to, stop dying. We need to enter the tech, right? We need to become one with the tech, right? That's very anti-Gnostic because isn't that just the human becoming a new demiurge? You are becoming the demiurge. You are like recreating that cosmic cycle because now you are a creator and you are going to create something flawed because you are not the highest Godhead. You are not, the monad. You are not the Christ Sophia, which are two names that Gnostics use to kind of refer to like the highest God, right? So it's kind of just creating a new demiurge situation. And I think it's not the same. I think if you have that Gnosticism understanding of just material bad, then yeah, transhumanism can be kind of Gnostic. But when you consider that the higher aim of Gnosticism is to break beyond our sort of material form and become like one with the Godhead, like I don't think that makes sense because how are you becoming one with the Godhead if you're going into tech? I think that doesn't make sense because you get in some really niche forms of Gnosticism a kind of like death cultism. A lot of religions are kind of death culty, especially the Abrahamic ones, right? Because you're waiting until you die and then you get to meet with God, right? And when you get to that kind of death culty feel of Gnosticism, of like our material bodies are a prison, and when we die, like we have a chance to be reunited with oneness, right? You are really going against that by going into the machine. So it is, I guess, if you create Gnosticism, if you define Gnosticism as disliking the material world, perhaps, but not in a broader sense. I guess some people could start thinking transhumanism and Buddhism could make sense because Buddhism definitely thinks like this world is a little of a like within Buddhism, right? We're living through samsara, or this constant cycle of life, death, and rebirth, right? And Buddhists really want to break free of that, right? Buddhists see repeating to reincarnate and die and be reborn as kind of like an endless cycle. And there's a very pessimistic interpretation of that some Buddhists have, right? And one of the big criticisms people have of Buddhism is that Buddhism is kind of cynical, because it's arguing that we're always going through this cycle, and only through, really intense monastic work can you break past it and achieve liberation or escape from samsara and nirvana or unity and dissolving into the oneness, right? In a sense, I would say Buddhism is probably the absolute hardest religion to win in, right? In Catholicism, right? Like you can kind of just like go to like confession and you're probably good. In paganism, right? We have a different view on that. In Buddhism, to achieve nirvana, right? You're probably not going to do that. I probably won't. You probably won't, right? Like it's very hard to win in Buddhism. You'll probably just be reincarnated, and a lot of Buddhists just kind of hope for like a good reincarnation, right? So I would say it's anti-Buddhist too, because it's kind of like fighting against samsara, but in a way that's weird. I could see a Buddhistic interpretation as perhaps transhumanism is a way to achieve nirvana while still being in this form, because you've like broken the cycle in a sense, because you're not dying and being reborn. But I would counter that even further with one of the key, first principles of Buddhism is that nothing is permanent, right? Everything is impermanent, everything is cycling, and I actually agree nothing is permanent. I agree with the Buddhist on that one. So yeah, you can't permanently escape into the machine to escape samsara. So if a Buddhist were to become a transhumanist, it would be perhaps the most extreme form of spiritual bypassing that anyone could ever be. Right? And I think this raises a whole discussion, and this is one of the core ideas of transhumanism and of Gnosticism that I raise is our material body bad? Is the material world bad? So if you believe in transhumanism, you basically believe the material world is bad unless we can fix it through our human power, right? I don't like the idea that the material world is bad. I don't think that is true. So I'm a little bit platonic in my thinking. I feel as if there's this hard duality, because when we're thinking about Gnosticism, we're thinking about transhumanism, because transhumanism is dualist, right? Dualism is systems that have this strong idea of like good and evil diametrically opposed. There's always a war between these things, right? Transhumanism is dualist because the way we live now is bad, but the way we could live if we go into the machine is good. So it's got a dualism to it. And I, as a Platonic pagan, do reject dualism. I feel as if, severity and mercy are principles that exist. Metaphysical evil does exist. But I see it less as a hard dichotomy and more as a necessity for there to be balance, right? For there to be creation, there must be destruction. That is how I feel. And when we look at, the tree of life, we look at this pillar of mercy and the pillar of severity. They both exist for a purpose. The masculine and the feminine are another expression of this, right? The masculine is merciful and the feminine is severe. A lot of people don't like that description, but that is the Western esoteric interpretation. And let me explain that in a way that sounds a little less bad. I'm not saying like the feminine is evil. That's an interpretation you can, I guess, theoretically get from this, but it's not one that I agree with, because when we think of the masculine, we're thinking of the generative, and when we think of the feminine, we're thinking of the constrictive. Think about the physical mechanism of reproduction, okay? Hear me out on this one. I can see people in the comments going, oh my God, your thelema is showing, but hear me out. So when a man releases his seed, okay, to create a baby, right? It comes out, right? It's released. It's an expulsion. It's a creative force. It's going out. But if there is no egg, which is the feminine, right? What happens when the sperm meets the egg? Only one sperm meets the egg, right? Only one gets to win. Maybe two if there's twins, right? But really what happens is all those other sperms have to die, right? If every single sperm could live, right? That wouldn't make any sense. There's like 1 million sperms per release. So there'd be like 1 million, you know what I'm saying? Like the woman would die. So that doesn't make any sense. You cannot not every sperm creates life. Sperm can't create life on its own, right? It needs the egg, and the egg constricts, the egg restricts. And then from that creation and that restriction, only allowing one, spending months and months for it to grow and be constricted, then it creates human life, right? Creation, restriction. Is it evil? The fact that the egg inherently destroys a lot of sperm in that process? No, that's not evil. That's necessary, right? The feminine is restrictive. The male, the masculine is about movement. And when we think about the planets in the sky, we think about the malefics and the benefics. They both have a purpose, right? Jupiter is a benefic planet. It's all about growth. It's all about bringing in new opportunities. But if Jupiter was not tempered by Saturn, the ultimate restrictive planet, what would happen? Nothing would get done. If there was endless action, endless new roads, right? Nothing would be followed. If we just had, open new roads in our lives all the time, but no discipline, which is a restrictive force, we could never follow down that road. And that's why I don't think dualism makes sense. If there is not that negative quality, that quality that takes away, nothing gets done. Nothing can exist. Things have to be balanced. Balance is critical. When we look at the yin and the yang, we see that white side and that black side with the dots on either side. That shows that there is good and evil and good, right? I think dualism falls apart really fast. I think, in a sense, dualism makes sense to our human brains because we cannot understand the fullness of divinity, but I don't think it's correct. And when you're supposing that the material world is wholly bad, you're taking a very dualist stance. I do not believe the material world is fully bad. I think there is actually divinity and beauty in the material world. And then the reason why I feel that way is when I go out into nature, I live in the Appalachian Mountains, for those who don't know, very famous place for creepy things and spiritual things to happen. When I go out into the woods, right, and I do, I go out into the woods at night like a crazy person. Um, I feel a spiritual presence. I feel divinity. I feel the gods there. When I do ritual to the gods, I invoke them and they come into this material world and they interact with me, right? That is a sign that there is divinity everywhere. And a lot of religions actually posit an emanationist framework. And emanationism believes that everything begins at one point and then it flows through all things. I am an emanationist. Basically, there's layers of nothingness, then somethingness begins, and then it flows through all the realms of the cosmos, beginning with the gods, then to the lesser spirits, then to us. That means that we all have a spark of divinity in us. While we are not God, there is a bit of God in us. We are just a lower level of that hierarchy. And thus, the material world cannot be evil, or we cannot have a divine spark. There cannot be divinity in nature. You cannot have any sort of animistic idea that there is a spiritual quality to nature if you are wholly saying the material world is bad. And in fact, even Buddhists, who we think of as, anti-material, actually don't even hold this position, right? If you look at Buddhism, you'll see, especially, in the Himalayan mountains, like them, like honoring the mountain, honoring the land. That implies there's a spiritual quality to the land, right? Everything flows throughout all things. So yeah, this whole material bad idea does fall apart very quickly, and you have to believe that to be transhumanist. In a sense, you can, and people will make this argument that systems that wholly posit the material world is evil are kind of like dark systems inherently because it's rejecting divinity that is clearly there. It's turning your back on some divinities, and I think that's a good spiritual thing to consider. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is death. So, another nice, uplifting topic. We only talk about nice, uplifting, happy topics on Pagan Perspectives, very uplifting content. I'm going to talk about dying. So, there is a sub movement of transhumanism called the Don't Die movement. And it is a really new movement. This is from social media, but it's gaining traction. So, I'm going to talk about it. Basically, there is this entrepreneur, that's what he's described as online, so I'm just going to say that, named Brian Johnson. People say he's like a cult leader sometimes, and perhaps. Basically, he runs this movement called Don't Die, which basically argues that humanity's highest goal should be defeating death. And the way he wants to do that is by doing all of these like weird, like wellness actions, doing all these treatments, doing big dinner parties. Like basically he does a bunch of crazy methods. He takes like 9 million supplements and he uses a lot of tech. And basically his goal is that we will find a way to cheat death. And when we are able to develop the technology, develop the techniques to defeat death entirely, right? We will have won. He actually said conquering death will be humanity's greatest achievement. And yeah, that's the goal. It's a movement. He holds summits, and it's a big thing that's growing. And it's very popular on social media. It's gaining a lot of traction, and I see this as kind of like the final boss of transhumanism because it is sort of the ultimate aim, right, to defeat death. And death, I don't think we can defeat it. Like, to begin, I don't think at any point humanity, and maybe, I think it's unlikely, we will find a way to completely defeat the reality that we will die. I find it pretty low in probability that will happen, but I cannot rule it out. I do not know. Maybe we will conquer death, and I don't think we should. I don't think we should. I think spiritually we shouldn't, and I think that it is a bad spiritual goal, for so many reasons. Why do we die? That becomes the question. So, when we consider the world, we have to understand that everything is happening on all levels at once. There is no separation. What is happening in our lives is happening beyond us. The best way to explain this is to consider astrology. We understand that when Mercury moves backwards in the sky, or appears to move backwards in the sky based on our eye, obviously doesn't literally move backwards, that it behaves weird in our lives. Why does it behave weird in our lives? Because we see it behaving weird in the sky. That implies that what is beyond us has an effect in our lives. And when we do ritual, when you do a spell or whatever, right, you're doing something to affect something beyond it. A good example I can think of is a binding spell. In European witchcraft, there is this idea of taking like two figure candles of a man and a woman and tying them together with rope and burning them down together. The aim of this spell is to bind two people together in love. If we look at ancient Celtic wedding traditions, there is a technique known as hand fasting. And basically what happens is during the wedding ceremony, two hands are tied together. That binds that couple together for the rest of their life in a committed relationship of love. Why does that work? Because it's then affecting the macrocosm, which then makes it so in our life, right? Everything kind of connects, as above, so below, right? That's the very simplified way to explain that. And death is happening on spheres beyond us. Not as literally, unless you're a Buddhist and you think gods die too. Some people do think that. That is the Buddhism, interestingly, people get Buddhism wrong. Buddhism is polytheistic, it is kind of pagan-y, but it does argue that gods are impermanent and gods die too. That's really one of the ways that it deviates out from Hinduism, which is kind of its like, root. And then there's other things like the whole Buddha bit veers out too, and a lot of the philosophies veer out. The big thing is that everything lives and dies, right? But even if you don't think like the gods live and die, you can see sort of references to this cycle in the sky and in the myths. When we think of the many myths that are sort of perennially popping up of descents into hell, right? These are very common. They're often associated with love and war goddesses. Specifically, Inanna, one of the oldest myths, is the descent of Inanna. What happens is Inanna has to descend into hell. Inanna is killed. She is dead for 3 days. And then she returns from hell back into her celestial realm in the heavens. We see this with Persephone. We see this many, many times, and we see it in the sky. The morning star is the first star we see in the morning. It disappears. It comes back in the evening. This is a sort of macrocosmic representation of the descent into death. And when we look at religions, we see this pop up everywhere, right? There is death, and then there is rebirth. So we also see this in the seasons. So every year, depending on where you live, especially if you live in a temperate climate like I do, like I live in America, the United States, we have, where I live, 4 seasons. There is fall, winter, spring, summer, right? And what happens is we see, on the winter solstice, the sun is reborn and the days start getting longer every single day. And then they get longer and longer and longer. And then they reach maturity in the summer. And then they start getting shorter again, representing aging. And then in the winter, right before the solstice, the days get the shortest, representing death. Then when they start getting long again, they're reborn. That is life, death, and rebirth. You see it with the flowers. The flowers come, they die, they come back, right? We see this everywhere. Life, death, rebirth is cyclical. It happens throughout our lives. It happens throughout the month. The moon goes through the same cycle, right? The moon disappears and then gets big and then disappears again, right? This is a cyclical sort of law of the cosmos that things die and then they're reborn. And when you're supposing that the goal is to conquer death, you are making a few theological assertions. One, death is permanent. If you do not believe death is permanent, right, why would you be afraid of it, right? It's pretty normal to fear the unknown. It's a human urge. But if you're, petrified of death to the extent where you want to be immortal, right, you must not think there's anything after that, right? Because in a lot of religions, there is an afterlife. There is a heaven, right? You see this is Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Islam, right? And then you have religions where it's reincarnation based, like Hinduism and Buddhism. And then there are religions where there's kind of multiple things that can happen, like a lot of pagan religions kind of have multiple things that can happen after you die. But pretty much every religion in some form or another claims that something happens after you die, right? Some religions think all of life is prison until you die. Others think that, life is neutral or life is good and then death is just inevitable and then it happens again, right? Whether you think, life is good or death is better or whatever, it doesn't matter. Most religions claim that something happens, right? That death is not the end, that there is life, death, and rebirth. Whether that life, death, or rebirth is a literal reincarnation onto that planet, whether that is a reincarnation into Freya's hall or into Valhalla, or if it's into heaven or hell, right? Something happens. You are reborn in some way. Life does not just end at the moment you are severed from your body. You are trying to conquer death, you are implying that nothing happens. That is a like true atheistic belief. And also, it is in a sense cheating in most religions. In most religions, trying to cheat death is pretty much a sin. Pretty much not allowed. There are a lot of stories and myth of humans who have tried to become immortal and then bad things happen. Right? Doesn't tend to go well. There are, stories of people making like little deals with evil spirits to try to live forever, and then they end up getting screwed over and dying anyways, right? This has been a thing we've been trying to do for a long time, right? Humans have been trying to become immortal since they were, I mean, really, really forever, right? There have been people who've been trying to break this. And when we're thinking about this, we're thinking of defying death in a sense as the ultimate break of divine law. That is pretty much the historic consensus. Like, no matter what religion you're in, if you do something to never die, you're breaking the divine law. And since the divine is more powerful than us, doesn't tend to end well for you, no matter what tradition you're part of, right? And so when we think of, avoiding death, we're thinking of something very anti-cosmic, very anti-spiritual, very against the nature of reality, right? It is a very, arrogant thing to do. And what happens is when we conquer death, if we ever do this, we are kind of becoming our own gods. We are, replacing the gods with ourselves. It is a narcissistic imposition. And it holds penalties in most religions. So yeah, that's kind of where it goes. It leads to bad places. I think that death happens. I think we need to process our fears of it, ideally before we pass, but it does happen. And there is a sorrow of death, right? It sucks to lose people. It sucks to, leave this realm. It's scary, but death is not evil, okay? Death is not bad inherently. Now, the next thing I want to get into is the idea of escaping into technology and leaving the mortal form behind. This is kind of a transhumanist thought some people have, that we should abandon our bodies and basically put our consciousness into the computer and leave reality behind. Well, that's suicide. One. I think we need to start there. If we are to abandon our bodies and go into the machine to live forever in that way, of course, there's the don't die movement doesn't want to do that. The don't die movement just wants us to extend our physical life. Let's go into ideas of leaving the body behind and entering the machine. Suicide. That's suicide. I don't know how to sugarcoat that more. And it would literally be choosing to enter a simulation and abandon reality behind. So many people are scared of this thought of like simulation theory. Like this is a common neuroses people have. Like, what if all our lives are a simulation? What if we're living inside some video game someone's playing, right? Most times when people think about simulation theory, they find that scary. They find that worrying. It's like a nightmare. If you want to not die, you are like basically saying, yeah, I want to go into the simulation. I want simulation theory to be true. It's sad, and you would inherently die if you left your body at it. If you could like upload your consciousness to the cloud, right, you would be dying. It'd be like a bizarre, it feels like a weird replication of like liberating yourself from samsara. Like, instead of liberating yourself from samsara, you're like liberating yourself into the iPhone, and it's just, it gets wacky. I think that gets wacky, and I think that is literally choosing the Gnostic nightmare of being in like a false reality, because you are in a false reality, right? If you upload your, consciousness to the hard drive, like the second that hard drive crashes or gets a virus, your consciousness is totally dead, right? Your body's dead, your consciousness dead, you're dead, 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 dead. You're dead maxing at that point. So, yeah, it's choosing to live in a prison. It is like, Gnostics typically don't want to be living in the prison. This is like, I don't know, like voluntary Gnostic hell. Like I don't even. It's weird. I don't like it, and I know I'm being very opinionated in this episode, but it's kind of hard not to, because the truth is transhumanism is opposed to like every religious belief. Like I don't know of one that agrees with it, so it's hard as an esoterically minded person to not be very critical of it. Now, the next thing I wanted to get into is transhumanism versus primitivism as a political axis. So another way some people define transhumanism is as a sort of political view, and they create this spectrum. Like, instead of like a left-right spectrum, they create a transhumanism and a primitivism sort of spectrum. And basically it's like, do we embrace technology as much as possible? Do we go into the machines? Or do we dismantle technology? Do we return to our primitive ways of living? Do we become Luddites? Do we get rid of the phones and get rid of industrialization? And this can get really extreme. It can become like we become cave people. Now, I don't think we should become cave people, but I also don't like transhumanism. So I think on this political spectra, I would say most pagans, I want to speak about paganism for a bit. So paganism is a broad tent term. It's a religious scholarship term. Originally, paganism meant like rural hillbilly, like that's the first historic use, because the last people to convert to Christianity were like random people out in the mountains who were kind of the historic rednecks. And then it kind of just became non-Christian, and now paganism, in most people's minds, means polytheistic pre-Abrahamic religion that has multiple gods, and it gets tied in with like returning to the land, returning to nature, doing all of this. Sorry. You cannot return to nature if you were a transhumanist. A lot of modern pagans, especially neo-pagans, really are about connecting to the land. They are about integrating yourself into seasonal cycles. They want to do the wheel of the year, right? And celebrate these Sabbats and do full moon rituals, right? And really go back to nature. If you're a pagan, transhumanism is doing the inverse of that. And in a sense, you are doing a radical rejection of transhumanism by becoming a earth-based pagan or embracing an earth-based form of spirituality. As well, generally, we see animism as kind of like a base that all religions come from. This would be a historical deviation that would be rejecting that animistic beginning that a lot of religions have. So I do not think you can be a pagan and be a transhumanist. I also do not think, to be clear, that a lot of people, when they're anti-transhumanist, they go really far and they want to like, undo all technological process ever and like, go back to being like peasants in the caves. I don't think you need to believe that to be a pagan. I think being a pagan in the world we live in now is very possible. But I do worry that if the world becomes more transhumanist, that might not be possible, because transhumanism is also a political project, right? It is as political as it is philosophical. There are a lot of people advocating for this and wanting to make this so in the world. And I do think if a transhumanist consensus is reached, right, where it's normalized to do all these things to yourself to extend your life and do all this, right, and make yourself a cyborg. I think it would then at that point become very hard to be a pagan, right? There are people who struggle with paganism now when they live in a city. I can't even imagine how they would struggle if we were a transhumanist society. I think a transhumanist society would be an anti-pagan sort of move, and I think it would, I don't know, I think one, paganism would either become way less popular or way more popular, and two, people would have so much trouble connecting to the gods. I mean, we know as tech has evolved, people's attention spans have gotten shorter, they've gotten, less connected to the spiritual in so many ways. I can't even imagine what a transhumanist world would do to people's spiritual growth. And I think it would be very, very hard to be a pagan in that world. I think that, as society changes, we adjust, we adapt, but some things do get harder, right? There are some things that change. The modern experience of being an occultist is not the same as it was 200 years ago, right? It is fundamentally different. The way we organize, the way we have groups is so different. The way we learn is so different. And, the occult community so far has kind of thrived online in some ways. But I think if transhumanism becomes the new vibe, right? I don't think paganism would be thriving anymore. I think it would really hurt people's ability to move forward. What would pagans have to do if this becomes obligatory or really common? I think we would have to reject it. I think it would be a sort of spiritual obligation to reject this. And I think that would put us in a kind of dissenting position. I think it would make paganism just more of an outlier idea. I think we'd lose a lot of people, and I think the people who stay would feel kind of repressed by society. I think it would be very, very hard. Um, is it inevitable is the very last thing I want to think about. Is transhumanism the inevitable future? I think it's not impossible. I think it might be our future, but I don't think anything is inevitable. The thing is, humans have this mistake they like to make where they think of history as linear. We like to think in linear terms. It's like how we like to think our spiritual journeys are linear when they're obviously often not. Our spiritual journeys are journeys, right? There's ups, there's downs. um, I do not think that, this is an inevitable part of the future, because there's a lot of opposition to transhumanism. There's a lot of people who see this as a possibility and they're scared and they're working against it. I don't think it's destined to happen at this moment in time. I think it could happen. And I think we need to consider that if it does happen, that doesn't mean it'll be permanent, right? Many, things that have become social norms or commonplace go away at some point in time, right? Just because something has happened at one point does not mean it'll last forever. I think we have a permanence fallacy in our human brains where we assume everything that has happened now will last forever, right? We assume the world we live in now will be in the world we live in forever. We assume our countries will remain the same. We assume everything will remain the same, and it doesn't. And when it doesn't, we freak the fuck out. Things are cyclical. There are golden ages and there are dark ages, and dark ages tend to precede the golden and vice versa. It is quite possible that there could be a transhumanist age, and then there is a revolt against it, a revolt against the machines, right? And we end up away from it, right? There is a chance that people get so fed up with AI and tech that things actually move backwards. We don't know. We can't be certain. I think transhumanism, though, I will say this, is going to become more popular. I don't know if it can ever become the most popular because a lot of people are just on a gut level kind of repulsed by this idea. And there are a lot of religious and spiritual people in the world who see this as kind of an evil thing. So I don't know. I think it's going to become a bigger conversation, though. I think we're going to see more people considering it, more people advocating for it. I think the Don't Die movement is definitely going to gain in steam. But I think some of their goals are just not possible. And there's enough people who are scared of it that I don't think it will happen. But yes, this is the occult perspective on transhumanism. I am Georgina Rose. I'm a perennialist and polytheist. I am a professional astrologer and tarot reader. You can book with me. The information will be below. I am supported through this show on Patreon. You get a bonus mini episode alongside every single episode. So if you want a little extra pod, you can get some extra pod. I also post bonus episodes 8 times a year, which are really fun. Other topics that just missed the cut for the show. And you can find me under Dot Darling on all platforms under the sun. I'm literally everywhere. I'm on Substack, YouTube. And if you're on YouTube, please leave a comment and a like. And if you're on a podcasting platform, please leave a review. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great day, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, wherever time it is, wherever you are. This has been Pagan Perspectives. Bye!